I've entitled this No Irritation Irrigation, solutions for keeping container plants well watered. Well, way back in 1917, there was a gentleman, actually very famous in his time, Liberty Hyde Bailey. He was an American horticulturalist, a botanist, and he was also the co-founder of the American Society of Horticulture Science. And in one of the books, I think he had written several, he gave the quote of, "The watering of plants usually exhibits the skill of a gardener or the lack of it. It is a practice that cannot be well explained in print." And I think sometimes we've all found that. I know, especially when I tell folks, you know, your tree needs a long, deep watering. Sometimes that's a hard thing for them to grasp. So the first thing we're going to look at is how water moves. And this is in the ground and why maybe irrigation would be necessary. But if you look at this plant, you know, it's being watered by rain. Okay, so how we've been blessed with rain this summer, but that's not always the case. Dry conditions, sunlight, all of this causes transpiration and evaporation in the soil and in the plant. And if you look at this diagram here, you can see that the plant has its main roots, but it also has many tap roots, and those are not tap roots, many root hairs. And those little root hairs are at the front line of absorbing all kinds of water and nutrients in the small pores of the soil. And they are important in our container planting. So why do outside container plants need irrigation? Well, we have higher temperatures outside. They may be in direct sunlight, may have evaporation, and it could be that they're in porous pots or clay pots. I really love clay pots. I just like how they look. But they are porous, so that anytime you water can evaporate from those clay pots a lot quicker than it would if you had it in a glazed pot or a plastic pot or something like that. Now, this is a little diagram I've created that showing the root hairs absorbing water held in the small pores. Okay, so when the soil becomes very dry, say if it's in a pot like this, and you know how quickly sometimes pots can become dry. I have even had some of my pots around the perimeter, you know, pull away from the sides. That's when you know it's really dry. And that's very detrimental to the plant. And you think, well, I'll just water it and it'll perk back up. And it does. However, when it becomes that dry, bone dry like that, all of those tiny root hairs you see there are compromised or maybe even killed. And so the plant can recover just as soon as it gets water, then it will start growing more root hairs. However, when it's regrowing these roots, then it takes energy away from the plant to do that. That might go into, say, your blooming of your flowers or the growth of the foliage or growth of vegetables, and, you know, and fruits and things like that. So whenever you kill the tiny root hairs, you do so at a detriment to the pot. So it would be best to keep your pot well hydrated. Oh, I think I went backwards. Okay, tips for making watering easier. So we're just going to talk about just some things that you can do before we even get into irrigation. If you can use glazed pots or plastic pots to help prevent that evaporation. Or if you like your clay pots, you can place them in another more decorative container, and that will help conserve water. Place a drip tray, and it says try there, but it should be tray under the pots, or a little saucer under the pots. That will help as the water goes quickly through those pots that have dried out. Hopefully the water will be captured at the bottom, and then they'll be able to take that back up. apply a layer of mulch or rocks to the surface, or use self-watering systems. Okay, now I'm going to talk very quickly or succinctly about self-watering systems. And while our drip irrigation system is a self-watering system, it's a little different. I have a little different definition here. So, all right, self-watering systems. And I know you all have probably seen these before. They're relatively inexpensive ways to, first of all, maximize a slow, deep watering, because for any plant, a slow, deep watering is best. It allows the water to seep way down into the ground or into the pot to be able to get to those places where those root hairs are waiting to uptake water and minerals. Your garden output, can be increased just because, you have more of a dependable watering there. And also it minimizes overwatering, which is important, and runoff and water loss. Now, this summer here in Kentucky, we haven't had to worry about that. We've had plenty of rain, but in other places, especially in drought situations, this is very important. And so you see here, there's little terracotta plant watering stakes. And in this situation, the porosity of the little clay stake works in our advantage, because as the wine bottle or whatever type of water bottle you have filled with water is placed in that little spike, then it is allowed to slowly drip into the pot. And then you can even get crazy and, like these little birds you see there, but you could also do it very cheaply. I've made them out of soda pop bottles, water bottles, and even milk jugs, just depending on how big of a job I want it done. Now, this little system, I love this, watering systems. It's called an Oya, and it is actually a low-fired clay. It's like your terracotta pots vessel. It's an ancient technique that was first used in China and North Africa more than 4,000 years ago. And it spread across the world, where there were dry, arid climates. And the plants are watered in this way, do not undergo stress cycles due to water loss, and can live and produce longer. Now, what I have found using this pot, and I actually used it this year, in our demonstration gardens, we were doing some moving around of plants. And it was, at the beginning of July, which is not the best time to start digging up plants and moving them around, but it just had to be done. But I was able to place my Oya next to a couple of the plants that we had replanted, and actually just keep them slowly and steadily watered, and they did really well and are still doing really well. Okay, so enough of all of that. We're going to go on to irrigation, which is a supply of water to plants or crops to help maintain life and encourage growth. And typically it's through the means of channels, like large channels dug into the soil, or pipes, tubes, or other means. And today we're going to be using microtubing. Okay, it can be as simple or as complicated as you like. Now, what I am presenting here today is extremely the very basic, very simple irrigation system. So, you can go all out and use PVC irrigation pipes and have all kinds of valves that control the time the water comes on and goes off. You can even add fertilizing functions to your irrigation system. But if you do, you also have to have another component to it, which is a backflow. It stops the backflow of the fertilizer going back into the water system that it's coming out of. You can do anything, program start times, days of the week, irrigation duration, all of those things. You can even have rain sensors that if it's raining, it'll shut off the controller's operation. But an automated system to water your baskets and potted plants is much simpler and easy to set up. So the basic components that we're going to have here are you need a water supply, a pressure regulator, a filter sometimes, irrigation timer can be handy. You will need poly tubing, something they call fittings, and emitters. And we're going to get to know what all of those things are. Okay, so first of all, the water supply. For your pots and hanging baskets, I would assume that your water supply is going to be your hose from out on the outside of your house. So you have to have that water bib there, that water supply. And it would help if you have a splitter, and that's that picture in the lower right there. This will split up the water, but you can have a hose attached, your regular hose attached on one side, and then you can have your watering irrigation system on the other. Now, a big component, and this is something I will suggest to you that you do need a pressure regulator, because in this system that we're using this small, flexible, what they almost call micro tubing. You will need a pressure regulator because the water coming out of your water faucet at your house has a very good pressure. And our emitters and tubing that we're going to use operate at a pressure, or pounds per square inch, of 10 to 30 psi. So, you know, if you had it coming straight out of the faucet and into your small tubing, you'd be blowing a lot of gaskets and everything else. So you do need this little pressure regulator, and this is the actual pressure regulator that I used in the very simple system that I set up. And as you can see, it plainly says that it cuts it down to 15 pounds of pressure per square inch. You also need emitters and tubings. Yeah, they cannot withstand. So this pressure regulator will step down the amount of water. Now, you may need a filter. I think with the system that I had on one side of my house, I have it hooked up to city water. I live out in the country, so we call it city water. And so I really didn't feel like there was much grit and that sort of thing in there. So I did not have a filter in there. And a filter can be, you can buy little screens that will fit down into the beginning of your hose that will filter out grit. And you can even get a little more complicated or a little more sophisticated, I guess is the better word with it, you know, and get to make sure you get all kinds of tiny particles. I feel like probably the only problem I would have with the one system that I use city water with is that eventually you'll probably get some of that, what do you call it, mineralization on some of the parts, and that can clog up. But I'm not so sure that a filter would completely help that. Now, on the other side of my house, like I said, I live in the country, and we used to get our water from a cistern. And so now that we have city water, we still use the cistern, which is capturing water off the roof of the house and going into, it's actually our front porch, is a big concrete thing. And we have a pump. So it's likely that there could be some grit or other particles in there that might clog up things. So in that case, I probably would want to consider a filter. Okay, now timers, I guess, can sometimes intimidate people, but they're very simple to operate. And so you really might want to consider a timer in your system. Only because if you don't have a timer, then your watering will depend on you or someone else to come over and turn on the water. And with an irrigation timer, you can actually set your timer. You can have a one zone timer or a very simple, like turns it on for so many minutes type of timer, so that it'll come on its own when you have set it, and you don't have to actually be there to do that. Also, especially when we're talking about maybe splitting up our irrigation system, as with like potted plants and with our hanging baskets, we would want possibly to use a 2-zone, what we would call a 2-zone timer on that. And this one, the top picture there shows you that. You can see hoses coming out. It has 2 different openings there and 2 different hoses coming out of there. And the reason for that is that you may have to water your hanging baskets more often than you would need to on your potting plants, just because they're hanging up in the air and that sort of thing. Okay, you also need poly tubing. And usually between 1/2 inch or 5/8 inch poly tubing, that's the larger, or 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch micro poly tubing. And I will tell you that what I am going to show you today, I just went with the micro poly tubing. Now, I did buy a little kit to try to help me along with this, and it did have the bigger poly tubing in it, but those were for more sophisticated applications that I wasn't going to use for my in-pot irrigation system, so I just went with the micro poly tubing. And both of these things are sold in rolls of various lengths, so you don't have to buy 1,000 feet of this. If you only need to, you're just going to set up a very simple thing that'll water your front porch pots while you're on vacation. Then there's all these things they call fitters, and the fittings are connectors that will allow you to connect the tubing and construct different angles if you need to. You'll have the hose connector, the poly tubing to connect to the hose bib. You may have L's that help you make a 90-degree turn. You will need probably some end caps. You'll have they have barbed fittings that help the micro tubing connect to the fittings. And you might even have T connectors and that sort of thing. Now, the system that I'm showing you today, that top fitting there, of course, it's a straight in line there. It's going from one to the other. Ours is a little different than that, but you'll see that in a minute. Okay, and then emitters are attached to poly tubing or the micro tubing and deliver water to the plant. Now, in this case, on the top there, you see the one with the orange caps. Those are actually emitters, and you can see that it throws up a nice spray of, or mist of water. We really don't want to do that in our in-pot system, because first of all, there's a lot of evaporation going on there. And then second of all, you really don't want to get depending on when you water though, to water your plants and have the water sitting on your leaves like that. But now in the case of a hanging basket, you might want to use an emitter because it is able to give a wider spray, in circumference over that hanging basket, and may deliver what you feel like water better to that. So, but in general, I think the emitters that you see there, we really don't need that. What we will be using is something very similar to this, the lower one there, the black one, that has one little endpoint where the water comes out, and then it has a connection at the top where the tubing goes in. Now ours looks different from that because I bought it from a kit, and I just used what came in the kit. All right, the first thing you will need is going to use the side of the house water, I call it spigot, or in a lot of the directions as a hose bib. So the water is going to come from the hose bib. Now, you can also, depending on what type of system you want, you can hook your irrigation system directly up to your hose bib and turn it on, and it will continue to drip. However, if you want to use this hose bib or your hose anywhere else in the yard or for other jobs, but not interrupt the irrigation system, you may want to buy something like this. This is called a splitter. Now, this is a little fancy. It's a 4-outlet splitter, but you can get, I have a 2 on the other side of the house, which works just fine. You can have a hose on one and then have your irrigation system on the other. The splitters also have on and off switches so that you can turn, each hose on and off. Now your water will still be on, but you can turn off the pressure, the water pressure to the hoses. The next thing you might want to consider are timers. This is a fairly simple one. This is just a simple timer. It looks like a 2-hour timer that you can hook up to your hose system. And you would hook this up to the water and then hook your irrigation system up here, or you can even hook it up to one of your splits off of there. And then you would set your timer and it would time how long it waters, okay? Or you can get more complicated and have a watering timer. This is a 2-outlet. You can set a clock. You can have a start time for how long, how often. So I think this one is programmable up to 7 days. Every 7 days, it'll restart itself once you have it all programmed. You also have 2 different lines coming in or out that you could program 2 different irrigation lines. And this would come in handy if you had hanging baskets and also potted plants. Your hanging baskets, just because they are hanging in the air and, are subject to more evaporation and maybe more sunlight and that sort of thing, you might want to water it more frequently than you do your other potted plants that are sitting on the ground or at your foundation or on your porch. All right, so we're ready for the next step. Now, we have our hose bib, and in any city water situation, the water pressure coming out of here is very stout. It's going to be a pretty good pressure. Even if, like on the other side of our house, we have a cistern and a pump. Even though it's not maybe as strong as this, it's still too much pressure on our little hoses that we're going to be using for irrigation. So we need to step down the pressure, okay? And this is pounds per square inch on the hose. You need to have, you probably need to get a little pressure regulator. This one was very cheap. I don't even remember what it was, but it was like $7, maybe $12. I don't think it was 12. It was in the singles, but $3 to $7 pressure regulator. And this takes the pressure down to 15 pounds per square inch. And the information that I have read, you want to take it down to about 20 to 10 pounds per square inch. So this is 15 per square inch, is right there in the middle. Now, the way this works is this is the hose. Here's the hose end, the tubing that we're going to use. And I will have all of the dimensions and diameter and everything of all the hose and tubing later, but for right now, we're just running through. This is a tubing that you're going to use. So you certainly can see that that is not going to fit on to our spigot. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put our pressure reducer onto the spigot, or I'm sorry, the hose bib. That had it there. Now, this is the adapter for going from a large garden size hose to our tubing. And I love the way this works. It's so easy. This particular one, and I mean, these were cheap as well. They were like $2, $3, and I think I got 2 in a pack. But they're very nicely constructed. Looks like it's brass. And you have a little nib here, a little screw down nib. So you take your hose, and if you can see, this has sort of flares out. You have a little flange there. And so you want to very tightly, oh, sorry, did that wrong. First of all, you want to put your little flange on there, okay? Or your little screw down, your tightener. Then you want to take, you have it like that, you want to take your tubing and then slip it over that and make sure that it goes all the way down. Now this tubing was very flexible and was easy for me to get on just, you know, by using my hands. They do suggest that if you have a little, if your tubing is a little more stiff, you might want to warm it up. You know, they said with a lighter or something like that, but something to just warm it up a little bit and get a little stretch to it. So once you have that on there securely, then you take this little nib here and screw it all the way down. And it very snugly and tightly holds your tube in there. So it's not going to go anywhere. I'm pulling on it and it's not going to go anywhere, which is great. Now you have the perfect adapter to add this to your pounds per pressure. Now I realize that if you have a timer and a splitter, you know, it's going to look like a lot here, but that's okay. You know, it's only the side of your house here and you're watering your plants. Okay, so now we have our tubing connected to a hose. We have the step down pressure, which is important. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get our emitters. It just so happens that in this particular kit that I bought, these are actually connectors, but also emitters. So, and it's easy for a straight line system. Now, if you're going to make turns or curves or anything else, you may need a few more of these fittings in different configurations, but just for today, I'm just going to show you a straight line product here. So we're going to get out our emitter, and I would suggest that you get a Ziploc bag too, or several Ziplocs as you start pulling out all of these. You know, there's not many parts, but they're all very tiny. So a Ziploc bag will help you keep them all together. But in this, here is our first connection. So this is going to be where the water comes out. So that's our emitter. These two ends are going to be the connectors. So we're going to connect our plants in a row. Now, when you connect plants in a row, you need to make sure that they have similar watering needs, okay? But, and like I said, this is just an example on the side of my house. So it's not going to stay here. I'm just doing it for example purposes. But you can take your tubing and see where our siding is here. In order to hide it, where you don't want everybody to know that you've got big lines running anywhere, you can actually take that, and for this, I'm able to push it up under the J channel here and hold it along this line here. I wouldn't really recommend putting it inside the J channel, but you know, up underneath there, if you can sort of push it up underneath there, or get you some tacky putty. And my little puppy here, he has to be in everything, so he's right down here below us. So anyway, let's say we have all of our lines the way we want them, and here is our first plant. This is a Mimosa pudica, better known as a sensitive plant. Okay, so we are going to take our tube and our emitter. And again, you see that little flange there, that's to hold the tubing on tightly once you get it on there. And these, I will say, are a little tougher to get on than the other, okay? So you have that one. And this little tube will actually lay right here within your plant. Now, I think you could stick it down in there a little bit if you wanted to, but I don't really want to clog it. So I'm just going to lay it in there like that. All right, so here we are down to our third plant, and we have it coming from the last plant. And then this is where the water will come out, the irrigation water will come out. And then this is the end that will take it on to another plant if we wanted to. We could continue on and on and on. But we don't want to do that. This is the end of the line for these particular plants. So I cut a small tube, and you could probably cut it smaller than I have, but just for demonstration purposes, I wanted to be able, everyone to be able to see it. So I put that small bit of tube there, and then in the little kit I bought, one of those little plastic bags, they had the end caps or the plug. So that will plug that end up, and you just push it down in there. Now, we're going to turn it on and cross our fingers and hope that it works. So this is our end, and there you have it. And actually, that's a pretty good little stream of water, and I don't have it turned on very high. So that's another tip, that when you do turn your water on, you just want to turn it on just very, very low, because as we all know, a long, slow, deep watering is the very best thing for our plants. Okay, so as this one is working, this one is working, and this one is working as well. So good. We have, there you go, a very elementary setup. And I'm sure that all of you out there could have all kinds of figurations and figure out much better ways to put this together. But just for the sake of our program today, this is just the very start. I have just very easily put this together. And it's probably been about 2 hours for us, from unpacking the boxes and figuring out what we have to putting it all together. Good. Okay, so there you have it. That was just a very simple walkthrough of an inline, straight line, whatever you want to call it, irrigation system. Now, if you were to do that for your hanging baskets, it would essentially be the very same. The only thing is that you would probably, depending on where your hanging baskets were, let's say that you had it on your front columns on your house, directly below where the guttering system and all that sort of thing is, you could actually use like Christmas tree light hangers and things like that to hang some of your tubing, so that it's up there, but it is hopefully rather inconspicuous. And also you could use those emitter that we saw that had the wider spray angle. I wouldn't spray that right over the plants, but nestle it down into the foliage so that it is getting at the soil more.